Great, thank you guys so much for coming. Basically, so yes, as Terry mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about understanding perceptions of species in the philo game. The philo game, potentially an ecological game changer, question mark. So just to get started, I want to give you guys a little bit of background about my own research. So as Terry mentioned, I am looking at human and non-human animal relations. My one question I'm asking is, what is the nature of these human-wildlife interactions? And I'm looking more at wildlife rather than domesticated species for some of this research, as there's been less research on those types of interactions. I do have a slightly broader question, but this boils down to how do we characterize this relationship? And as I've been looking through the literature, I've kind of noticed that generally people look at it in three sort of overarching categories or different approaches. The first of which is differentiation between humans and non-human animals, or a lack of differentiation. The second is the relative benefits that both parties or one party may accrue throughout the relationship, or lack of benefits. And finally, the agency, specifically usually of the animal, or a lack of agency of the animal, in that relationship. So more specifically, what I'm looking at through my research is I have kind of 4 studies, the first of which is looking at the general field of human-animal studies, where it stands today, where it's moving, and sort of trying to understand that piece in general. Secondly, I'm looking a little bit more at specific examples of wildlife-human interactions. This is looking a bit more into that benefits piece, and it's looking at sustained human-wildlife relations along with more transient ones. And for this, I'm partnering with the Vancouver Aquarium and working with their staff and the general public as well. Third, I'm looking into some people's perceptions of animal agency. And then building on this, I'm looking more into general perceptions of species, and also, are there ways to alter those perceptions? So this is the piece that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, before I get in fully to my research, I want to discuss one quick study that was published back in 2002. It was called "Why Conservationists Should Heed Pokemon." Now, this study, basically what it did is it looked at school children in the United Kingdom and asked them about their knowledge of local flora and fauna, asking them to name a number of different flora and fauna they were presented with, and then asked them to name a number of Pokemon characters. And what this found was that for the local flora and fauna, children around age 4 could identify about 32% of them. By age 8, it was about 53%. And then over age 8, it fell slightly from that 53%. Now, for the Pokemon identification, at age 4, it was about 7%. At age 8 and above, that rose to 78%. So this paper finished with the statement that conservationists need to reestablish children's links with nature if they are to win over the hearts and minds of the next generation, and asked, is Ecomon the way ahead? Well, the reason I mention this paper is because it was really the basis for the creation of the philo game. Oh wait, sorry, before I go on, in case you guys were testing yourself, there's the answers. You can see where you fall in those categories. So, as I mentioned, the philo game used this as the basis for its creation. It was started by David Ng in the Michael Smith Laboratories here at UBC, and he worked with a number of collaborators over a number of years to come up with a deck that would look similar to Pokemon, except using local, in this case, BC species, both flora and fauna. So they created a number of different cards using a number of different species. They also created a number of so-called event cards so it could be played in a competitive fashion. Each card had the name of a species, a picture, a fact about it, and then some information such as its diet, trophic level, where it lives, the environment, terrain, etc. The game itself, everyone would have a two-person competitive game. Each person would get a deck. You would use that deck to build out an ecosystem in front of you. You could also use those event cards I mentioned previously to destroy parts of those ecosystems, and the person with the most points at the end wins the game. Now, subsequently, there's been a number of expansion decks that have added species to this game. There's also been a number of other decks that focus on other locations, other types of species, dinosaurs, other organizations have been involved, Natural History Museum, Muse Magazine, etc. So this has really led to the creation of a number of different species that can all be used in this game. It's an open source Creative Commons game, so kids can design their own ones, other organizations, And really there's been a lot of additions to this. So it's really a burgeoning, increasing game that we want to look more into. Oh, and the most recent one is changing a little bit from those flora and fauna, and the most recent deck that just came out was the Women in Science deck. So this is all great, this is clearly big, this is going on, but does it actually work? And this is where we come in. So I've been working with Alejandra here in the department and working with David to try to look at this game a little bit more closely. He really wanted to know, does it actually work? Does it do anything that they envisioned when they created it? So we created a study and looked at a number of different things, and I want to focus on a few of them here, kind of some general questions that we had. But does it actually change people's perceptions about species? Does it improve people's knowledge about species? Does it impact donation behavior? Can we use it in that way? Is it even a fun game to play? And is it the new Pokemon? Well, so first is to talk briefly about our study design. What we did is we had people come in, we had them in lab experiments in pairs. A lot of them were from the human subject pool, the undergrad psych pool, and they would do it for credit. In addition, we had a few other students, grad students, and other ones come in as well. So when they came in, they were given a pre-survey. This asked questions about their perceptions of species, their knowledge of species, their intended donation, an affective measure, along with a number of other scales and questions as well. After that, they were sorted into one of three conditions. They played that philo game, which I mentioned previously, or they watched a slideshow, which was a PowerPoint. They could go through at their own pace. This used pictures from the philo game, but had information on how to build ecosystems, what trophic levels every species was, things that they would potentially see while playing the game, but they weren't actually allowed to play the game. Finally, the third condition was the so-called projects condition. This was a different game. It's still a philo game. It's by the Genetic Society of America, but basically instead of building out ecosystems, you're gathering projects such as genome sequencing, and you're trying to gather resources, research techniques, species in order to complete those projects. So it's a very different setup, but we still wanted it as a control for the act of playing a game. Now, when they were done with one of those three conditions, if they had played a game and they won, they would be given a toonie. If they lost, they'd be given a loony. If they were in the slideshow condition, it would be randomly given. Then they were given a post-survey, once again on the computer, very similar to our pre-survey, with a few additional demographic questions and other questions as well. Finally, they were given a debrief and given a chance to donate that money if they wished in private, or take it with them when they left, equally private. So moving forward, what we looked at, we didn't want to look at every single species in the game. There's quite a few. So we chose 4 main species. It's the Clark's nutcracker, giant kelp, earthworm, and 3-spined stickleback. We chose these because they represent a number of different diets, a number of different environments, and they weren't iconic or charismatic megafauna that people would focus on more intently. So our study, we had about 209, exactly 209 participants, 70 in the philo condition, 71 in the slideshow, and 68 in the projects. The average age is about 21.5 with a range of 16 to 59 years. The gender, we had about 59% of the people were female, 40% male. And then we also asked them what their own knowledge was of species, from 1, not at all knowledgeable, to 7, extremely knowledgeable. We found an average is about 3.8, and this is just a graph of the distribution of those responses. We also asked a more qualitative question of where do you consider home, and the majority of people listed Canada, followed by the US, and then China. So now, to get into a few of our results. Going back to those questions I asked at the beginning, or earlier, the first one of which is, does it change people's perceptions about different species? We looked at a number of different perception categories. These were decided upon and refined using a pilot study. The first of which was ecological perceptions. We asked people questions they answered on a Likert scale, the questions being things such as, other species rely on this species for their survival, or this species is important to its ecosystem. We also looked at economic perceptions of species. Questions were things such as, this species provides raw materials for human use, or the harvesting of this species provides employment activities. And so what we found, first for the ecological perceptions, there we go. Down here you can see these are the 3 conditions, philo, projects, and slideshow. The lighter blue is the pre, the darker blue is the post, and there are the means in red. And we found that both the philo and the slideshow condition significantly increased in their ecological perceptions of species, whereas the project's condition did not significantly change at all. And we also asked people some more qualitative questions, specifically what comes to mind when you think of this species. And we coded all of those responses for a number of different codes, but one of which was ecological, and this was things such as, this species is in a complex ecosystem, it's important, it would be bad if this species went extinct, those kind of things. Those were all coded in the ecological category. And we found that it kind of matched up with what we were seeing in the quantitative data. Both the philo and slideshow did have more qualitative ecological responses in the post and the projects really didn't change that much. So it was nice to see this kind of matching up. Now, for the economic perceptions, what we saw with this was that the project's condition significantly increased their economic perceptions, and the slideshow significantly decreased. Now, at first we were slightly confused as to what this was, but then when we went back, we looked at the cards, we looked at what people were seeing while they were playing the game, and in the slideshow, and there really wasn't mention of people's any sort of economic value for these species. However, in the projects game, there's lots of mentions of money. There's cards where you lose funding or gain funding. And in addition, species cards, although not the ones we were testing, are used as resources to build these projects. So it makes sense to us that those economic perceptions would increase, whereas the other ones would not. And once again, looking at the more qualitative data, it tells a sort of similar story to what we were seeing before. Now, the second question was, does it improve knowledge? We didn't want to focus too heavily on this because we knew that Dave wanted to do additional studies looking at this later with the philo game, but we did want to put in a couple of questions that sort of get at this issue. The first of which we looked at was the species. We looked at each of the species, more specifically their diet, and we asked whether, for example, Clark's nutcrackers are autotrophs, carnivores, herbivores, etc., and had people select their answers pre and post. We also asked about the environment of the species, so which one of those environments they live in. And we based all of our answers on the cards themselves, what was specifically on the cards, so that it was standardized and that people could get that information from playing the game or watching the slideshow. Now what we found, this is, so the incorrect on the bottom here, and then the correct, and once again, pre and post for each of the conditions. We found that the philo and slideshow conditions both significantly increased from pre to post. And the projects did not change at all, did not significantly change. For the environment question, what environment do these species live in? Once again, we found the philo and slideshow significantly increased, and the projects did not significantly change. So moving on to our third question, does it impact donation behavior? Now, in the pre-survey, I mentioned briefly we had asked people's intended donations, so we asked if they could donate to one of those 4 species, to one of the 3 ecosystems, forest, grassland, and ocean, or one of the 3 causes. These were the event cards, so climate change, wildfire, oil spill, or they could keep their money, which would they do? And then in the post-survey, we gave them the opportunity with actual money to donate if they wish, or keep their money. Now, we were looking at whether there were associations between the donation category and the condition. These are the donation, we lumped those into the different donation categories I mentioned before. For the pre-data, we found there were no associations. However, for the post-data, we found that there were, and these were driven primarily by a number of different categories. First of all, in the projects condition, the causes donations were less than expected. In the philo, the ecosystem and species were less than expected, and the causes were more than expected. Now, this sort of makes sense to us because in the game, those event cards can have a big impact on people. They often lose or win the game depending on whether they played an event card or didn't play an event card or got one played on them. So it makes sense to us that this is a little bit higher of a focus in that condition. So, is it fun? Well, we didn't look specifically at this, but one thing we did look at, one of our scales, was the PANAS scale, the positive and negative affect scale. And what we did find was that both the philo and projects condition significantly increased in positive affect, whereas the slideshow did not significantly change. None of the conditions significantly changed in their negative affect. So we can say it does have a positive effect on the positive affect. But also, if we just go from the more qualitative in terms of people's responses, what they wrote down or what they verbally told the researchers, the words fun and enjoyable were certainly used a lot more with the game conditions than they were in the slideshow conditions. Finally, is it the new Pokemon? Well, it's a little bit trickier to answer, and certainly we haven't seen Philo TV shows or all of merchandise or anything. But one thing we did look at was we asked a question at the very end of which one species do you most remember from the Philo game or the slideshow, depending on what condition they were in. And we got some interesting results for this. For the Philo game, this is all of the different species that were mentioned. You can see it's not complete same distribution, but there's quite a few species mentioned. In fact, 76% of the total species from the game were mentioned by people in the Philo condition. In the slideshow condition, you can see it's not quite as even, and only 58% of the total species from the game were mentioned. What's also interesting is we looked at whether or not those species were ones that we'd mentioned in the survey, so one of those 4 survey species, or whether they were ones not in the survey. So for the Philo condition here, you can see the majority of the responses were ones not in the survey, which means people are remembering them from actually playing the game, not necessarily from giving that survey a couple of times that they'd seen them multiple times. However, in the slideshow, the majority of the responses were ones from the survey. So it could be that they're just remembering those from the slideshow, or it could be that they're seeing them a bunch in the survey as well. But the one thing we can say is the Philo is picking up remembering ones from the survey, from the game itself. Now, we did do a delayed post measure 1 month later. As you can expect, there was much lower responses, only 23 for the Philo and 16 for the slideshow. So we didn't feel we had a big enough end to run any sort of statistical analysis on this. However, we did want to look at those more qualitative questions, specifically the what do you most remember? And what we found is that for the Philo game, there were still quite a few responses. And it's interesting because people were also writing out the whole name. They were writing out European honeybee or Himalayan blackberries, not just bee, blackberry. So they were actually remembering the specific species that they played in that game. For the slideshow, it was less responses. And once again, if we're looking at which ones are in the survey or not in the survey, the Philo, the majority, once again, were not in the survey, which means they actually are remembering those, since there wasn't any other sort of information for them in between that month when they played and when they answered this. So that's really interesting, and especially if, what we were looking at was the Pokemon game to begin with. This game was built kind of based on that. And based on that original study that said people weren't remembering local flora and fauna as they were remembering Pokemon, this is really interesting because it does show that this game potentially helps remember more of those species than a more traditional kind of slideshow form. So just to end with some conclusions here. When we're looking at the Philo versus the slideshow game, can we say one is better? Can we say that? Well, no, it really depends on what we're looking at. There's certainly a lot of similarities between the two of them. They both do increase ecological perceptions. They both increase knowledge. For the slideshow, it did have a higher frequency of correct responses. But the Philo game had increased positive affect and did seem to increase the species remembered after playing. Now, hopefully this study in general can kind of build and lend itself more to the discussion of games as tools specifically for increasing eco-literacy. And there aren't that many of those games out there, and there aren't that many studies of those games that are out there, so hopefully this can kind of provide a model or at least lay some groundwork for future studies looking at similar games and perhaps even other forms of the Philo game, other decks and other locations using other native species. So yeah, this is a new field, and hopefully this is providing a little bit more information into that field, into that field and research. So just some acknowledgements. Big thank you to Alejandro, who's been working really hard with me on this. Dr. David Ng, Dr. Terry Satterfield, Dr. Jiang Zhao, Dr. Kai Chen, this is my lab group, and all the RAs who worked on this project. And thank you to the Michael Smith Laboratories for their funding. So thank you. Questions? Questions? Yes, Kylie?
Thank you for this I guess I was wondering with your two native Obviously, you were targeting university students.
Yes.
Very learning that way. Would you, based on the literature, your experience, would you expect to see different types of?
Yeah, oh, sorry, so the question is, would we see different results if it was not university students? And certainly that is one thing, ideally we would have loved to look at more children because that's sort of what this was initially targeting, but just based on resources available, we did have to look at university students. I don't know necessarily if we'd see different results. I do know that even one of the students mentioned, well, I tend to learn more from someone talking at me than I do from looking. So, it certainly depends on kind of how people would learn, whether or not so that might be just more of a personal rather than university versus other type. But I don't know for sure whether or not we'd see strong differences. I think that's definitely a great follow-up study as to different populations, different ages, and see whether or not these results are replicable in other ones. So yeah, we definitely thought about that and wished we could do other things, but we're a little more tied by who we could get. Is there, yeah? Yeah, we actually, the question was if there was a difference between people that got the loony versus the toonie. And we still actually are looking into that. I should have mentioned, we're done with the data collection. We've done a lot of the analysis, but we're still doing a few more, and that's why I really appreciate the feedback. So we do want to look a little bit more at the loony versus the toonie, and that's why we put it in there initially, to try to tell the difference between people that won, people that didn't, and see if that changed anything. So we haven't looked as much into that as we would like. That's kind of our next step. But yeah, that's definitely something we want to keep kind of looking and see if there is anything with that. All right, Terry?
I'm just wondering if you want to comment on the relative strength of the slideshow nonetheless.
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, that's definitely the main, the stronger, we did find a higher frequency of correct responses for people that watched the slideshow when they were doing kind of the knowledge questions. But yes, the big difference probably is that species remembered. And I mean, we can't say necessarily that people are only picking, in the slideshow condition, they're only picking from the survey. But it very much is telling that those are the ones that people are selecting, whereas in the philo game, I mean, they selected a broad range of things, and people were, there was a mycorrhizal fungi somebody remembered. A lot of people remembered phytoplankton in the follow-up survey, which is not necessarily the first, species that jumps to mind. We would have thought sea otter, whale, blue whale would have been the more common responses. So it was really interesting to see some of those other ones, because that really made what people were playing in the game, what cards they were playing, what they were using, a little more important. We did ask them why they remembered some of those species, and we haven't looked through all those results, but some of the things did definitely mention as to how they were played, like I really needed a krill so I could get my whale out there, or something like that. So there were certainly some of those responses as well. Yes? Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we look at that, oh wait, sorry, that's not, hold on. Okay, coming back. Is it back? Okay, there we go, sorry. Economic?
Yeah, so I'm curious what the value of the
Right. Yeah, it's not, that's just where for the distribution, where that is. And generally, I mean, and the ecological was definitely bumped up more. I mean,
What are these values?
oh, these are, so we asked different, there was between species, each species get a score between 0 and 15, basically, was the overall score. But then this is showing where the kind of the distribution or where the most responses tended to fall. Then,
So there's two ways in which results not be accepted.
right,
One is the quality of rate is not substantial,
yes, definitely.
but also these are very honest students who maybe they can actually have a question of whether they think or find.
We didn't actually ask anything about their about Pokemon or anything like that. I guess the one thing we did do is we did put that other game. We did put the other game in there as at least for a control for the act of playing a game, so that when we got results from the Philo game, it was actually the Philo that was having an impact, not necessarily playing a game itself, because we had that other game in there to control for that. Okay, yes.
And one will absorb every little piece of information that I give about. And if there is this kind of heterogeneity in the population, what do I take away from this kind of exercise?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you're going to find, individual differences, and we're looking at larger groups. We did run a power analysis, try to figure out, what was the max number of people we needed to make sure it was statistically significant. So, we do see almost 70 people per condition. So we are hopefully getting some of those people that could care less about any of this, and some of those people that are super fascinated by it. And hopefully by, running kind of this larger set, we are seeing, well, with enough people, there are differences. There are differences with the Philo as opposed to the general projects game or something. So, it's great. Certainly, we're seeing, hopefully, showing some of those differences. But it is individual. We can't control for that entirely. And that is time. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate all the feedback.